We'll now turn to Peter Hitchens for the opposition.
Well, good evening. It is distressing sometimes to see mature politicians trying to get down with the kids, and it reminds me of the big problem which we face in the modern world, which is that you're supposed to come to this place to learn how to think, not to be told what to think. And whenever I see a room full of slavish conformists all putting their hands up, agreeing with each other, I think these are people who've been told what to think since they were first pulled off the teat. And I see this now. And I'm not in the slightest bit intimidated by it, because I fear the problem that you've almost all faced, is that none of you have actually heard any arguments against the proposition which has been put to you tonight. And they are simply not heard. And I would, first of all, like to conduct my own brief poll. First of all, how many people in this room have taken an illegal drug? Please raise your hand. Right, put your hands down. How many of people in this room have actually been arrested and prosecuted for it? Right, exactly, my point's entirely. We are told ceaselessly, here's the first lie that we're told: there is a war against drugs which has failed. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no war against drugs. There has been no war against drugs in this country for decades. It was abandoned after the Wooten Report, which recommended a policy of gradual covert decriminalisation, which has been followed by Labour and Conservative governments ever since. The Misuse of Drugs Act of 1971, on which this is based, is unique in British parliamentary history. It's the only Act of Parliament that's ever been placed before the House of Commons by both major political parties. It only wasn't passed by Labour because they lost an election in 1970. It was then immediately passed by the Tories. Ever since then, the government has reduced and reduced and reduced the penalties for cannabis possession. I don't know where Norman gets his information from if he thinks people are being sent to prison for simple cannabis possession. It simply isn't true. In October 1973, Lord Hailsham, the Lord Chancellor, that well-known Trotskyist, could summon the Magistrates Association to a conference and instructed them to cease sending people to prison for cannabis possession. They duly obeyed. You can get sent to prison for cannabis possession in combination with other crimes. You can possibly get sent to prison for cannabis possession if you persist in doing it 10 or 15 times. But for simple cannabis possession, the main response of the police is to do absolutely nothing at all. Some years ago, they invented a thing called the cannabis warning without consulting Parliament, which is a way of letting you off. But since then, they've more or less abandoned arresting people for cannabis possession at all. And a recent BBC Freedom of Information survey showed that even cautions for cannabis possession had fallen by 48%, arrests down 46%, this is since 2010. The number of people who are actually using it, as you've just illustrated by your show of hands, and the number of people prosecuted for it bear no relation to one another at all. So there is no war against drugs. Cannabis in this country is effectively legal. The head of the Scotland Yard Flying Squad said in 1994 it was a decriminalised drug, before most of you were born. It is a decriminalised drug. So what are we arguing about here? If it's effectively legal, if you can buy it and use it without anything happening to you, what is this campaign about? Now, I'm sure all of you in this room are terribly in favour of fair trade coffee, and you're against big greaseburger chains and multinational corporations which want to pour sugary drinks down the throats of children and turn them into lard buckets, because we all are, aren't we? We're all against big, evil, greedy corporations which want to make money out of making people ill and out of other people's misery. This is something we're all agreed on. And yet every single one of you have put your hands up in favour of an extremely subtle, well-organised, hugely financed, billionaire campaign backed by an organisation I call Big Dope, which knows perfectly well that there is one remaining prize within its grasp thanks to people like you: the chance to make billions all over the world out of exploiting people out of human misery. They can do that if they achieve their target, which is actual legalisation. What difference will it make? To you, in your ability to buy it? None. To you, in your ability to buy it without being arrested? None. To them, in their ability to market it, to advertise it, to distribute it on the internet, to sell it everywhere, to the cynical politicians who similarly wish to levy very heavy taxes on it to fill the vast deficits they've accumulated. To them, a huge benefit. To you, none. And not merely none, worse than that. So much rubbish is talked about cannabis and its alleged harmlessness. The purpose of the Wooten Report, the purpose of the whole campaign, which began in 1967 for cannabis decriminalization was quite simple: to separate this particular drug from all the other drugs, to call it a soft drug. There is nothing soft about it, ladies and gentlemen. I know from personal experience, and I recommend to everybody in this room, you can read my book, The War We Never Fought, if any of you have the courage to do so and find out that you don't know anything about the subject. But forget that for a moment. What you must read is a book by Patrick Cockburn, the greatest foreign correspondent of our age, a friend of mine. It's called Henry's Demons. It's an account of what happened to his son Henry. His son Henry, who began smoking cannabis at school at the age of 13, who was one of the most promising children of his generation, and who is now terribly, terribly, terribly mentally ill, and will be for the rest of his life. And I can tell you that when Patrick wrote that, and when he wrote about it in his newspaper, The Independent, he started finding a curious thing. Friends of his would come to him and say, "This has happened to me too," over and over again. People would write to him and say, "This has happened to me too." The great suppressed medical story of modern times is the huge number of young people whose lives are blighted as a result of thinking that cannabis was a soft drug. There is no safe way of taking cannabis any more than there is a safe way of playing Russian roulette. There is no possibility of knowing which of you, by smoking cannabis, will end up in the locked ward, and nor any possibility of when it will happen. I had correspondence a few months ago from a woman whose husband, a skilled carpenter and woodworker who had been smoking cannabis for 30 years and who dismissed her fears about it, had one morning turned so violent that it had taken 10 policemen to drag him from the family home. He is still in a locked ward of a mental hospital, and he looks likely to be there for the rest of his life. These are the tragedies which happen. And if you doubt any of this, then you just need to consult the writings or indeed the broadcasts of Professor Sir Robin Murray, one of the most eminent psychiatrists in the country, who will tell you that cannabis is correlated with psychosis. And there isn't any question of that. Now, somebody this evening will say, correlation is not causation. Well, actually, this is a lie. Correlation is not necessarily not causation, nor is it necessarily causation. It may be causation. It is the foundation of epidemiology. If you have nothing else to go on, and in the very, very complicated world of mental health and mental illness, which is very hard objectively to define and diagnose, it is extremely difficult to find any other basis on which to work out whether this is a dangerous drug. But I assure you that it is. And anyone who tells you that it isn't is either foolish or has a commercial motive for ruining your life and not caring because they've made so much money out of you that it doesn't matter to them. But it will matter to you, and if it doesn't matter to you, it will matter to somebody else. I am constantly told, nobody can tell me what to do with my body. It's absolutely nobody's affair what I take, what I do. This isn't true. Alas, though in some ways a good thing, most of you probably are not parents. And as a result, you have no conception of the grief and misery loaded onto the shoulders of the families of those who suffer particularly mental illness as a result of drug taking. The misery is lifelong. The responsibility is appalling. And to say that this is an act, a crime without a victim, is utterly and completely false. And again, you can consult what Robin Murray says about the parents whose children have taken cannabis and who have ended up in serious trouble, to see what happens to people who think that they can do anything they like with their own bodies. It may be so, but no man is an island unto himself, and nor are you. And there is very definitely a large number and a growing number of victims from this greedy, cynical, big dope campaign to which you have all fallen victim. Medical cannabis, just a moment here, but in 1979, a man called Keith Stroop, one of the leading lights in NORML, the long-standing and very well-financed American campaign for the legalization of marijuana, said in an interview with a university magazine called The Emery Wheel, which I have seen, and he denies it now, but he did, he said, "We will use medical cannabis as a way of getting pot a good name, as a red herring for getting pot a good name." I have never yet encountered a campaigner for medical cannabis who has not been sitting or standing at the side of a campaigner for recreational cannabis legalization. If you were serious about wanting to legalize this drug for medical use, you would not associate it with recreational use. You would stand well aside from it. They never do. They are the patsies and indeed the victims of a much wider campaign, and you should be very careful of this. One other small point about medical cannabis. Thalidomide, the terrible, disastrous drug prescribed to women for morning sickness and pregnancy was extremely effective against morning sickness. Oh yes, it was. That's why they took it, and then afterwards they found out why they shouldn't have done. A drug is only as good as its side effects, and if its side effects are terrible, and if you think a lifetime in a locked ward is not terrible, then you haven't seen a locked ward, then it isn't a medicine. So be warned of all these things. I haven't time to continue with the many, many other points which doubtless will come up during this evening. These are the fundamental ones. This is a huge, expensive, well-financed, cynical campaign by people who want to make money out of misery. You should be against it if you had any conscience or any heart at all.
Thank you, Mr. Hitchens. We will now open the floor to the audience for questions. I must remind you to be courteous, so if you have a question, just raise your hand. I have to stress that it's one speaker at a time. So if you have a question. Yep, boy in the middle.
At the beginning of your speech, Mr. Hitchens, you took a straw poll of this incredibly white room, and none of us have been prosecuted for any drug crimes. However, the reality is in 2015, 80% of people brought in for drug crimes were of ethnic minorities, and a vast majority of those from working class backgrounds. What policy solutions can you suggest with this admittedly, as Mr. Singh admitted, not perfect policy to rectify this clear discrepancy between the treatment of ethnic minorities and poor people when it comes to drug policy and us, relatively middle class and white group?
Oh, believe me, I am an equal opportunity arrester, prosecutor and incarcerator. The whole lot of you should be arrested. I have no trouble at all about the white middle class being arrested for cannabis possession. If it's being unfairly done, make it fairer. I'm all in favour of that. I'm sure you are too.
We've got a couple of questions emailed in. Let's speak about that.
So, before I go on to my question, I just want to say that, he talks about big dope, that's the actual comparative in this debate. Whereas we don't have, currently in the status quo, artisan cannabis grown by hipsters with beards in Shoreditch. We have criminal gangs who import it, who traffic cannabis across borders, who are often involved with other organised crime, human trafficking, killing people, all sorts of bad things that we're comparing it to. So we can't talk about big pharma like that's going to be, big dope like that's worse. But specifically on poor people, because I think that poor people are probably likelier to live in areas where they're less policing, where there's more dominance by gangs, so they're going to be more exposed to the drug trade. They're probably going to be given less benefits of the doubt by the police, and they're going to be arrested for drug offences more frequently. And at the point where they require legal aid, they're going to not be able to afford a lawyer, especially with cuts to legal aid, and so they're probably going to get worse representation, they're going to have worse outcomes, more likely to be in prison, which leads to all sorts of things like isolation from society, familial alienation, loss of employment. So the question for you is, given that we live in a similar society where poor people are probably going to have a worse time in the justice system, where white middle class kids who have money can afford to get a good lawyer who'll bargain it down to a plea bargain, do poor people's lives matter?
Of course they do, but crime is crime, and it should be prosecuted whoever commits it. Everybody should be equal before the law. I've just said I'm in favour of prosecuting rich people. The whole drug problem, all these cartels you complain about, these filthy gangs which are ruining societies in the Far East and the Middle East and in Latin America, they're all financed by you. It's your pounds that end up in their pockets. That's what makes these people rich. That's what pays for their guns. That's what pays for the murder. That's what makes it worthwhile for them to murder people, so they can carry on selling stuff to you, you selfish, ignorant people. And I don't think you should try and avoid this responsibility or place it on anybody else. It is you who are the Mr. Big of this thing. You are behind it. You, untouched by the law, won't listen to me. No one ever does when I point. Nobody is arrested for possession of cannabis anymore. It just simply does not happen. To most people, look at this room full of cannabis users and they haven't been arrested. Why do you think it's going to suddenly start happening now? They've given up. The police have abandoned it. Stop pretending. And it's a nonsense to try and turn this into an argument about poverty. It's a middle-class habit. Everybody knows it's a middle-class habit. You just need to go to NW1. The place is full of it, and the other stuff as well. It's not a sigh of the oppressed creature. It's greedy, selfish, self-indulgent people doing something foolish which finances a terrible trade. And one other small thing. All crime is caused by law. there wouldn't be any crime if there weren't laws against it. The point is, why do we have laws against it? We have laws against things to protect people, in this case, largely to protect people from their own stupidity. And if you decided to legalize it, then what you'd be doing is merely turning the government and big corporations into criminal purveyors of a dangerous substance. In what way would that be an advance of any kind? You're not thinking.
I must admit, as a author of the motion, I was a little disappointed by quite evasive and sentimental arguments from the supporting speakers, although I do still agree fundamentally. I would like to address one thing, though. Drug dealing is, although illegal, it is a legitimate source of income for many impoverished people who have no other means of income. Legalization would effectively destroy that occupation for many people. What you propose is an outcome for those people who are actually relying on drug dealing for their own welfare.
Okay, well, there is inequality in society, and that inequality is not necessarily based on people's own efforts, but based on other circumstances, such as where they were born, the colour of their skin, and everything else, as we just heard on those previous questions. But I think it's a fallacy to argue that because someone is making a living from something, it shouldn't be taken away if it's the wrong thing for them to do. I mean, otherwise we'd still be making leg irons and exporting them. But fortunately we stopped that, although no doubt people who were working in the factory in Birmingham making leg irons, because they were, then became out of work as a consequence. So I think we have to have the right kind of laws in society which have the benefits of society as a whole, but we also have to recognise that there are consequences for individuals and then take steps to try and help those individuals when they find themselves disadvantaged as a consequence of a social benefit which is introduced for more wide purposes.
May I just make it small, but you really don't worry about these people. Legal substances are still the subjects of illegal gang operations because they're taxed. And the biggest problem faced in this country by HM Revenue and Customs is not actually illegal drugs, but the smuggling of legal tobacco and alcohol, which takes up far more of their time and is a much bigger criminal activity. So don't worry. There'll be plenty of criminal activity for criminals to carry on doing if they want to do it. No unemployment among criminals is threatened.
I'd like to invite into that, if that's okay. Yeah. Thank you. If I'd had more time to develop my speech, which sadly was slightly badly timed, I would have actually made the proposal that if we only nationalised cannabis, then actually people would still have that as a legitimate job. One of the areas which I'm concerned about is children who go into dealing and then who are treated very unfairly under the current system. If we nationalise, then all of the revenue, the £400 million, I believe, which is spent on policing cannabis currently, and then the roughly 900 million, which is spent by the drug, which is spent by people buying cannabis, would then go to the state. It would support people, and young people would be able to have a legitimate job in working, perhaps you could say, in shops or in government outlets where they were supplying this.
Yeah,
just consider it.
Build more mental hospitals. You don't need them.
There'll be enough money. You can do that as well. You can build support for people. It's an awful lot of money.
Gentleman in the dark blue top there.
I have to say I agree, at least partially, with Mr. Hitchens when he says that there is no war on drugs. The place where the state is supposed to control you most, which is prison, is rife with drugs and is rife with. I know people who've been to prison, and they actually have cannabis there every day. They actually have areas where you have to request to go in to a non-drug area, and actually it's done incredible harm to a lot of these prisons as well. But I have to one thing, we make laws based on the idea that one of two things: either they infringe on the rights of the individual, or they disturb social peace. So I have to ask Mr. Hitchens, how does cannabis disturb the Queen's peace?
Oh, well, it's not absolutely clear, but there was some talk earlier on about how cannabis wasn't associated with violence. Let me read you a list. The following people, all of whom, either through police records or through accounts of their own intimate friends and companions, were or are cannabis users, in most cases heavy. Seyfeddin Rezgui, the mass killer on the beach in Tunisia at Sousse. Jared Lochner, the man who murdered 6 people in a massacre in Tucson, Arizona, and also badly wounded Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords. Diane Dianoff, the man who killed by beheading her Jennifer Mills Westley in Tenerife. Nicholas Salvador, who beheaded Mrs. Palmyra Silva in London. Michael Adebolajo and Michael Adebowale, the killers of Lee Rigby. Sharif and Said Kouachi and Ahmadi Koulibaly, the culprits of the Charlie Hebdo killings. Ibrahim and Saleh Abdeslam and Omar Ismail Mostefai, the culprits of the Bataclan killings in Paris last November. Martin Rouleau, killer of an unnamed Canadian soldier in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu in October 2014. Michael Zihaf Bibo, the killer of another Canadian soldier, Nathan Cirillo, in Ottawa, also in October 2014. Jonathan Bowling and Ashley Foster, who, for no available reason, beat to death the Sheffield church organist Alan Greaves. And Ayub Al-Kazani, who attempted a terrorist outrage on the Thalys train between Amsterdam and Paris. Now, the point about all these is that they form a subset of crime. That is to say, the sort of crime which the media really thoroughly cover. So you can find out with a bit of diligence that cannabis was involved in these crimes. It is my view that if there were to be an inquiry in which every violent crime was investigated and the drug habits of the culprit were investigated, we might find that there was an even stronger correlation than that. But the idea that cannabis is a peace-promoting drug which makes people better behaved is absolute drivel, insupportable by any facts. The possibility that it may actually be linked with serious violent crime exists through correlation, and I urge you to pay attention. There's almost every single terrorist incident of the past 2 years. This has turned out to be the case. These people are regular cannabis users. It is not a peaceful drug. And the idea that it is has to be rejected by any thinking or informed person.
I think it's a very odd argument to say that because someone has used cannabis and then they have subsequently committed a crime, therefore cannabis is responsible for that crime.
Said that.
Effectively, you have, actually.
On a point of order, I will not have my opponents lying about what I have said. I did not say that. I read you a list of events. I told you what had happened. You have concluded from that that was the case. I have not. Do not lie about what I have said. It is very bad debating practice, and it puts people off your arguments.
I don't think accusing people of lying is terribly helpful in the debate anyway. I don't see why. I'd be interested to know why you're reading out a list of people and then talking about cannabis if you weren't making that point. Otherwise, what was the point of making that statement in the first place? You could also argue, no doubt, that all those people that eat McDonald's hamburgers, for example, and then go on to commit crimes.
Hamburgers aren't major psychotropic drugs.
Move on to the next question. So, lady in the orange top.
You said that legalising will protect children, but I really don't see how that could work, because thinking about it, people who take drugs, they're more likely to potentially have unprotected sex. They're not going to care, are they, about protection? They're likely to have kids. And regardless, even if people weren't taking drugs, they've had a kid, how are they going to look after kids if they're high all the time? There's enough cases of children being taken into care and being abused and stuff because of like alcohol, for example. So add cannabis to that mix. Kids are just going to get neglected and taken away, and then say the parents get schizophrenia, which is a serious, strong link, so that's true. How's that going to be to one parent to explain to the kid, sorry, your mum's in hospital, she's not coming back, she's got schizophrenia. I don't see how that's good for children.
Well, firstly, I would worry that you're basing that on some of the rather false claims made by the other side. My point about children and about protecting children was in fact a very specific point, which is that you would protect children from consuming cannabis, you would protect children from getting involved in drug dealing. That would be very much dependent on the model according to which you legalised. I mean, I understand that you could be worried that legalisation could take the wrong form. The model which I would propose would be that if you legalised, you would do it in a very regulated way, so that obviously children would not be allowed to consume it. There would be limits which people would have to have, like people could only take a certain amount. I think that to suggest that people who take drugs will not be able to look after children is beyond the scope of this to a certain extent, because this is really a debate about how you protect children from taking the drugs themselves. That was the statement which I made. I understand why you'd be worried about it, but it's not the point I was making. And to be honest, sorry, do you want to say anything?
Well, I just want to say very quickly that the fact is that there are people already suffering, children are suffering now, either because they're killing themselves with legal highs, which are far more dangerous than cannabis, or because their parents have been using legal highs, or they've been using alcohol. When they come to use alcohol, they come back and hit the kids sometimes, because as Freya says, there's a clear correlation, to use that word Peter likes, between people who use alcohol and violence. And that's very, very well proven. And the Home Office figures, which I gave earlier on, £21 billion a year cost of society from alcohol abuse, 11 billion only from all drugs, all illegal drugs put together. So there's the answer about violence. The violence comes from alcohol.
Well, let's have some restraints on alcohol then, but we're not talking about that. I would go back to the 1915 licensing laws, which existed for most of my life until Tory and Labour parties combined to get rid of them in the 1980s and strongly restrict the sale of alcohol in this country. It's disgraceful the way it's so easy to get. But that's not what we're arguing about. We're arguing about whether we want to introduce another crazy legal poison into society, and what logic it is which says we've got two really dangerous legal poisons in our society, alcohol and tobacco. That's an argument for having another one. Doesn't seem to me to be very intelligent.
Let me answer that point directly, Peter. The fact of the matter is that if the people go towards alcohol now because often cannabis is illegal and still difficult to find.
Because they can't get it.
Yes, some of them. And if cannabis were, all they're worried about the legal consequences of being busted. If cannabis were legal, there would be fewer people drinking alcohol and the violence would actually go down.
Okay. Gentleman in the checkered shirt.
Yes, to Mr. Hitchens. While it's rather tempting to cast aside the pledge made on our behalf for politeness, after having been called a slavish conformist.
That's just a statement of fact.
After having been lectured on how to think, I think we've been presented with some rather thoughtless arguments. As Peter highlighted when he asked us to put our hands up, people are already taking the drug, and there's a link between the drug, as you say, and mental health issues. Why is it now not a better idea to turn it over to legalisation? We already pay our dues to the corporations. I, in fact, have a Diet Coke in my pocket. Why would it not make more sense that we regulate and possibly reduce those damages, given that people are already taking the drug?
Why spit on your luck? As it happens, we have a law which we can use, which if we use it, can prevent the spread of this drug further into our society. We have it. It's a weapon that we have. A lot of us have seen in our time relatives of our own die, for instance, from cigarette smoking. I, in my early years in Fleet Street, saw several colleagues die from drink. And it would actually, in both cases, have been beneficial to them had the law been usable to prevent the sale, distribution, consumption and possession of these substances. But it wasn't. It's gone. You cannot actually make illegal a substance which has been in mass legal use for a long time. Once you have dispensed with the law against cannabis, you will never, ever, ever be able to put it back. We have, as I say, this piece of luck. The research coming, when the initial campaign for the legalization of cannabis began, nobody even knew what its active ingredient was. Now we know a lot more about it. The evidence about the mental health risks is coming in thick and fast every day, thicker and thicker. We're at the stage now where we were at with tobacco in the early 1950s, where the correlation was frightening, but the proof of the connection with lung cancer wasn't there. And indeed, the behavior of big dope is very similar, and there's a chapter in the book describing very similar to the stupid lies and complacency of the big tobacco lobby in the early and late 1950s, when they were trying to stop measures to actually control tobacco, and killed thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people unnecessarily by their refusal to actually recognize the truth about the product they were selling. Now, big dope doesn't want you to know the truth about the product it wants to sell, because it wants it legalized, because it knows that once it is legalized, it will remain legal forever, and there will be nothing we can do about it. Regulation is just a euphemism. There is no regulation. In the past few years, do you really think that alcohol is not obtainable by children? Do you really think that cigarettes are not obtainable by children? Have you not noticed the ever-increasing strength, both of wines, beers and spirits, because the manufacturers have found that these sell better. Do you really think that any government which is anxious to tax these things will have the power to restrain this if the enormous corporations who otherwise act as banks or grease burger manufacturers or big pharma or whoever it is who will take this over, do you really think government's going to be able to stop them exploiting you and making greater and greater strength drugs and selling them? And do you think government is going to mind as long as the taxes roll in? Of course not. Once it's legal, it will stay legal. This is the last chance you have to stop a terrible mistake.
Okay,
You've already stated that you think it is.
No, I've said it's been decriminalised. There is a distinct difference. Legalisation permits advertising, marketing, promotion. It allows the banks to finance cultivation. It allows it to be sold openly over the internet on the high street. It completely transforms the situation, and it would raise the danger of cannabis to so many more people. There is a total distinction between decriminalisation and legalisation, and please don't say that they are the same thing. That's what I mean. I don't know whether Norman believes this stuff or whether he understands it, but the effect of what he's asking for is a huge triumph for the big dope lobby. They will be able to advertise, sell, and market this product in a way that they cannot do now.
The fact of the matter is that how it's legalised is a matter for the state to govern. And the way it's been dealt with in Uruguay, it doesn't have this free market approach where it's available on every street corner. In Colorado, there's a rather freer approach, which I don't actually agree with, but in Uruguay, it's quite tight. If you look at how alcohol is sold in Sweden, through the system for lager, it's quite difficult to get alcohol. When I wanted a bottle of wine in Sweden, I had to order it 3 days in advance. You know, you can actually have the state controlling this in such a way, both the regulated price, the amount of stuff that's available, and indeed the strength of what's available. And that's a better arrangement than we have at the moment, where people buy legal highs and kill themselves.
We do have to move on now, try and fit in a few more questions. Gentleman at the back.
So just to bring it back to moral responsibility. So when you have the choice to do something and you choose not to, clearly you live in a more responsible society. Now the thing about alcohol and smoking, as you brought up, the reason that it's so difficult for me to understand this is because you said marijuana is almost basically legal because we've shown people smoke it, we've shown people sell it, so clearly people are using it. The question is whether are they using it responsibly, right? So when you have something like marijuana, tobacco and drinking, the constant advertising is use it responsibly, be responsible, have one drink, don't have six. So in a society where something is legal, it's encouraged that it's used responsibly. So people won't step up and use the worst drugs. People might not get high and attack someone, go on a random rampage as you listed your vast list. As you know, in a society where things are legal, people tend to use them more responsibility. For example, pharmaceuticals. We have access to pharmaceuticals which can be mixed with various substances and create very exciting times. As you know, it's not a good idea to take more than 2 Viagra, you could have a heart attack, Mr. Hitchens. So I think it's very important to understand that when something becomes when the reason criminal law is there is to protect us, so it's not protecting anyone. Therefore, we should remove the barrier and allow responsibility to take place and then develop a society where we have the option to smoke weed, we just choose not to.
If you'll applaud that, you'll applaud anything. I don't know what it's like in Brighton, but on Friday night and Saturday night round where I live, there's an awful lot of... On Friday night and Saturday night round where I live, there's an awful lot of people behaving terribly responsibly on the streets. You can tell how responsible they are by the fights breaking out and the pools of vomit and the people half naked lying around drunk. I do not think that drink and the legalization of it is a very good example of the supposed advantage of regulation.
Okay, lady in the hat.
The current policies around the use of cannabis takes away our moral autonomy. It tells us that the government does not have enough belief in its citizens to make their own decisions about what they choose to put in their bodies, but they will make that decision on their behalf. This lack of trust in the citizens, what message is this sending society, and what effect is this going to have later on as we continue to tell people that they are incapable of making their own decisions? Also, you said that people are so easily exploited and they are victims. which I think is the root cause of many other things in society, kind of like this victimisation of people, taking away this moral autonomy. I say we should give people more credit than that.
Okay.
Good luck with that.
Gentleman over there.
You talk about like big dope, but if cannabis was legalised, I would like it in a manner where I could grow it for myself. It's actually very easy to do. And everyone's talking about the market.
How do you know that?
How do I know that? I've seen videos on YouTube. You also mentioned lots of anecdotes about like the sad story about your friend's 13-year-old son who got mental health problems. My dad is very quite liberal towards cannabis use himself, but if he caught me at 13 using cannabis, he wouldn't allow it. Essentially, I'd catch him eating. And
didn't catch you much.
No, I didn't smoke at that age. I do because of parental responsibility and personal responsibility. And I think it's been like scientifically proven that to a developing brain, cannabis is bad. So I feel like even if it was legalized, parents wouldn't then allow their children to use it, and it comes up to parental responsibility. If you understand what I'm saying.
Is this a seance? Is there somebody there? I think parental responsibility lies ahead of you. And therefore you might not know how difficult it is. He's not going to stop, obviously. Chairman doesn't seem to be anxious to stop him either. You will know when you have parental responsibility how difficult it is to know what your children are doing at all times. It's a simple point.
When I was younger, it was actually easier to get cannabis from a dealer than to buy alcohol. To buy alcohol, you need an identification. To buy cannabis,
So you get somebody else to buy it for you. But I'm sorry to give you some tips, but that's how it's done. It's very easy to find children drinking alcohol in most parks and most cities in this country at certain times of day. It's not, but I don't know what point it is exactly that you're making. Parental control cannot be absolute. If it is widely available, it will greatly increase the ability of children to get hold of it. Children can get hold of alcohol. They can get hold of tobacco. They are legal. They are regulated, and they get hold of them. If there is cannabis on open sale in this country, it will be more available to children, and indeed to everybody else, than it is now.
I think it would be safer strains as well, though. I think the strains will be safer.
There is no such thing, as I said. I think there is no such thing there was no safe thalidomide, there's no safe cannabis, there's no safe Russian roulette. You cannot take powerful psychotropics without risking a very, very serious outcome. You may get away with it. You may not, but the problem is you don't know until afterwards, and by that time there's nothing you can do about it.
Okay, the gentleman in light blue top.
I have actually a question for both sides, as I'm somewhere in the middle ground on this particular debate. So for the group that are supporting this argument, earlier in the debate the argument was made that there are more deaths related to alcohol and tobacco than there is weed. And you briefly mentioned that the entire concept of legalization in that case should be reversed. So in that case, are you stating that alcohol should be illegal, yet weed should be legal?
No, I'm actually.
I share Peter's view on this, that you can't turn the clock back. You can regulate things better, and there's certainly steps to be taken with alcohol that should be taken. For example, the Prime Minister vetoed a move I wanted to make, which is to stop setting up pubs and motorway service stations, which I think is disgraceful. We've got those coming on stream now. So you can do stuff to regulate alcohol and tobacco has been better regulated over the years with plain packaging and so on. Alcohol hasn't been, because the alcohol industry is too powerful, or at least the government's allowed to be too powerful. So I'd like to see more regulation of alcohol and stricter controls on that. It's what you do with alcohol. And in terms of cannabis, what we were talking about here, I think on this side, is not a free market, free-for-all. It's a closely regulated government process, like the one in Uruguay, which would allow someone to grow particular plants themselves, and the strains would be the weaker strains, not the stronger strains, because they are different in strength. So you can actually end up with a better situation. Where I come from is minimising drug harm, and I strongly believe that by having cannabis legalised, you actually minimise drug harm, because you move people away from more dangerous substances onto a strain of cannabis which is less harmful.
I have a question for both sides. The question that I wanted to present to Peter Hitchens and the against side was that earlier you made the argument that correlation about correlation and causation, and that that weed essentially was correlated with increases in crime, and you gave obviously that massively large list. Well, I'm sure that many of those people may have also smoked or may have also drank. And alcohol, of course, is related to crime in many ways. They may have, taken Tic Tacs that morning for all we know.
Oh, don't be silly. Try to argue seriously. Cannabis is a powerful psychotropic drug. The main active ingredient is tetrahydrocannabinol, and it alters the mind. Tic Tacs do not, and I think a grown-up person really shouldn't put forward an argument so pathetic. You should do better. I did not say anything about cause. I said there was an interesting correlation, and the point about it is that, when I started in journalism more than 40 years ago, almost every court case was covered by a network of local newspapers, and a huge amount of crime reporting was done, which is not done anymore. It takes quite a lot these days for any crime to be covered in detail and for the details to emerge. Often a major terrorist incident or the awful beheadings, which were not terrorists, which I mentioned there. The point that I was making was that where we know about violent crime, we often know that the violent criminal involved was a user of cannabis. And this, A, contradicts the idea that cannabis is a peaceable drug, and B, suggests a correlation which might well be worth investigating further. I drew no conclusions from that. That was Mr. Baker. On the point about people being killed by cannabis, we don't really know. Cannabis being fat-soluble remains in the body for a long time after it's used. And it is very often found, for instance, in the bodies of drivers of lorries, of trains, and of cars which have crashed after investigation. And in recent months, because of the introduction of equipment which can test people for driving while intoxicated by drugs, huge numbers of people, 400 people a month, are being arrested for drug driving. Do you think they're driving more safely as a result of smoking cannabis than otherwise? And isn't there a danger? The question with cannabis doesn't seem to me to be death. Actually, it seems to me to be irreversible mental illness, which is in some ways even worse for the families involved. But if you're really going to say that cannabis causes no deaths, be very careful, because the increasing use of it as a decriminalized drug by people driving may well be leading to deaths, and they're not being listed as such because nobody bothers to look. And nobody bothers to look is an important part of this. Okay, but don't give me the Tic Tac stuff again.
I'm going to take a few more questions. Lady in the back top there.
Okay, you say it would be more available, but the thing is, you've already said that you can easily just call a dealer, get it any time of day, any time you want. If it was legal, you could check people's IDs, it could be handed behind the counter, you could see on the packet the health effects that you do for tobacco. Now they have things shut behind it, so you can't even see the packet. And obviously, with alcohol, people are still able to get it, but it would be easier for children to get alcohol if you didn't have to get IDs, and you can't always get someone in the shop to buy you alcohol. So how would it be more available to children?
Well, because there would be so much more of it. It seems to me to be so blazingly obvious. If you have a product which the government is gaining tax, or a government which is absolutely broke is gaining tax revenue from, which advertisers are advertising, which is available readily on the internet, which can be delivered by Ocado once it's legal, or by Tesco's, which is available in high street shops, there will be more of it about. And if there is more of it about, then more of it will get into the hands of children. And I have to keep saying it. The fact that alcohol is restricted and there are attempts, and cigarettes are restricted and attempts are made to restrict these, does not prevent either product falling into the hands of children. Why would it be any different in the case of cannabis once it was marketed? It's simply not an argument. And the other thing is, I keep saying this, there is no safe dose. For many years, the tobacco companies tried to get something called a safe cigarette marketed. The government rightly wouldn't give them permission to do so. They said there is no such thing as a safe or safer cigarette. There is only one kind of cigarette. It's dangerous. It will kill its users, so we aren't going to allow it. There is no safe dose of cannabis because nobody knows which of us is going to, if they use it either over a short or a long period, end up irreversibly mentally ill, dependent on their family, dependent on the state, dependent on the taxpayer, and themselves miserable and thwarted.
Okay, gentleman at the back there with glasses.
Your argument seems to hinge on how bad cannabis is because of schizophrenia. And all the... Pardon?
Because of its what?
Because of schizophrenia, mental health issues?
No, I don't even use schizophrenia. I've never used it. I don't use it.
You did. You did. Well, psychosis, but that's it's a result of schizophrenia. But and also these weak correlations which haven't actually been definitively proven to exist anyway. Why, in the last 100 years, when cannabis use has increased dramatically, have these instances of psychosis in the population not increased as well?
Yeah, it is interesting. One of the reasons is that a lot of the people who suffer from cannabis are the people who end up homeless in doorways. The other reason is that, largely thanks to Enoch Powell, no hero of mine, the mental hospitals of this country were largely demolished during the 1960s and 1970s. And mental health treatment in this country is a disgrace and a scandal. As I think Norman will agree, it is extremely difficult for people who are mentally ill to find beds. The mental health side of the National Health Service is incredibly inadequate, and it's not anxious to obtain more patients because the pressure is there anyway. So two things are happening. One, a lot of the people who are suffering as a result of cannabis are not on the grid. They don't have GPs. They're not being recorded. They're not seeing anybody. Nobody is actually treating them. Nobody actually cares whether they're ill or not. Secondly, and the reason why I don't use the term schizophrenia, the boundaries of mental illness are not easy to define. They're all defined by a volume called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, the DSM. If you read it, you'll find that schizophrenia has had its own definition altered over the years. About 20 years ago, they said homosexuality was a disease. Now they say it's not. This is the kind of document it is. You cannot definitively say that people are mentally ill. What you can say in the cases of many of these people is that they have thoroughly ruined their lives, that they've thrown away their education, they've become ineducable, unemployable, and they are a burden on themselves and society. But a measure which actually says how many of them are ill is very difficult to make, and the state is not interested in making it because it's got enough problems with an inadequate mental health service as it is.
The one that's difficult to prove that these people are mentally ill. How are you? Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You're saying that people are becoming mentally ill because of cannabis, but yes. So how? You've just said that the people aren't getting diagnosed.
With an open mind, which is this: here is a potent psychotropic drug which alters the functioning of the brain powerfully and alters the consciousness of the person who uses it. Here is a drug which is also associated and correlated in many, many cases with people suffering mental illness. Now, I can't say that it seems to me to be a huge mental stretch here in working out what might be going on. Are you having trouble with that? Because if you are, I really cannot take you any further without Norman Baker telling me I've said something I haven't.
Okay. I mean, the one point I give with Peter is that there aren't enough mental health beds or money in mental health at the moment in this country. But I'm interested in the point you made about the correlations to use out where we now seem to be using all through this debate between cannabis use and its legal status. Because you're right, the cannabis use has mushroomed over the last 50, 60, 70 years. And guess what? That's a time when it's been illegal. Look at the situation with heroin. When heroin addicts in the 1960s had access to heroin in the NHS, carefully controlled to try and deal with their problem, when that was stopped in the 1970s, the heroin problem mushroomed in this country. And there were far more people using heroin and committing crimes to fund their heroin than previously. And prohibition in the United States didn't exactly work, did it, in the 1920s, 1930s. So the idea that the government can ban something and stop its use is actually not just false, it actually works the opposite direction.
Okay, we are running out of time. I'm going to take a couple of questions, a few questions at once, and to give the panellists a few seconds to work out their answers. So, gentlemen, you? Yeah.
Please, why does the government deny that there aren't any medical benefits at all of cannabis? Surely it's just authoritarian propaganda that works to their agenda. And I believe sort of an alternative system, let's say, like down to more legitimate authorities, say like parents, peers and friends, to say someone stop taking cannabis, say if it was like decriminalised or no law at all with it, no state involvement at all basically, would a system like that work if it was more down to the individuals to decide whether to take cannabis or not?
Okay, lady over there, yeah?
I just wanted to say, I think it's quite interesting. We've taken this poll today and shown that a lot of people are using cannabis anyway. I think people are going to be taking this drug whether or not it is legal. So would it not be more beneficial to both individuals and society to have, for people to be taking these drugs where they can find advice on it, they can do it in a legal setting, they know what they're getting, and we can regulate it, and also we can hold people accountable if they provide cannabis which is dangerous, or they don't sell it, they don't tell people exactly what they're getting.
Lastly, you, sir? Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of just a comment, kind of a question. I was just going to say, like, I think really what needs to happen is we need to. I don't really feel like we actually acknowledge drug use properly as a society at all, and we need to change the entire way that we actually look at it. And because we don't really even have drug education in schools, like nobody really learns about drugs in any sort of proper way. It's all just mixed with scaremongering and fear tactics, and when you do start getting drugs that are introduced into your life, you start thinking like, oh, okay, you try weed and you think, oh, this isn't so bad or whatever. And also, until we start doing that, I think like people are going to use drugs irresponsibly, and if we want the facts that drugs are illegal is surely like a massive barrier to actually being able to start educating people properly about them. Yeah.
Hitchens?
Medical cannabis. I'm not quite sure why people are so convinced the government is against it. GW Pharma, which manufactures Sativex, was licensed to produce this. It is available under certain circumstances on the National Health Service. Before that, there was a drug called Nabilone, which was marketed as a suppressant of nausea and chemotherapy, which didn't take off very much because it wasn't terribly effective. The problem with cannabis as a medicine is that, and I quote here from Professor Leslie Iverson, who is not on my side in this argument, he said there are clearly several possible therapeutic indications for cannabis-based medicines, but for most of them, evidence for the clinical effectiveness of the drug is woefully inadequate by modern standards. He also says one of the obvious complications in the medical use of cannabis is that the window between its therapeutic effects and the cannabis-induced high is often narrow. In other words, people can't tell whether they're feeling better or whether they're feeling euphoric. There is another simple point about this. It's extremely difficult to do proper double-blind placebo tests with a drug which is known to make people high. The person who's getting the empty sugar pill will know he's getting the empty sugar pill. So this is one of the big problems. Not very far from here, I can't tell you where it is because it's an official secret, a cannabis farm licensed by the Home Office which produces cannabis for the manufacture of Sativex. So the idea that the government has its face set against this is simply false. It has for many years licensed the laboratory investigation of cannabis. I just wish people would listen to what I say. There is, I've done a lot of these debates, and I find out that I say these things to my opponents, and they're factual things. And at the end of it, they come back with an answer which clearly shows that they haven't heard a word that I've said because it didn't fit with their preconception. There is no serious attempt to enforce the laws against cannabis possession in this country. They're just not being enforced, and to maintain that they are is ridiculous. There is no safe way, in response to the lady over there, there is no safe way to take a drug which might irreversibly and unpredictably make you mentally ill. There is no safe way in which regulation would attain that end. How many times do I have to say it? If you can show me that the logic of my point is in any case in any way wrong, or indeed factually wrong, then do so. Otherwise, please stop saying the same thing over and over again. It isn't an argument. It's unresponsive. It means you're not thinking. And that is what I came here to try and make you do. I think that's really all I had to say about this.
Well, I want to consult the audience, actually, when I respond to these points. On the medical benefits point, Peter said earlier on that people who were advocating the medicinal use were simply a smokescreen for those who wanted recreational use. I have to tell him that I've seen a number of individuals, including here in this area, who've got conditions which normal drugs prescribed by the NHS don't give them relief, and cannabis does. And they include people suffering from MS, people suffering from epilepsy, and indeed, some cases, people suffering from period pains and rheumatism and that sort of thing, which the Chinese knew about many thousands of years ago. So I think it's deeply insulting, frankly, to those individuals who've got serious medical conditions to say cannabis doesn't work for them when it does. And I've got letters upon letters sent to me as a Home Office Minister from people who say they've got those conditions, and please can they have the relief which they're securing illegally now at risk of prosecution, rather than have to do that, they want it legally provided for them. Of course there are some people who want a smokescreen, but that's not to deny that there are genuine people for whom cannabis does work. Why isn't there more investigation into it? It's because it's a Schedule 1 drug. It shouldn't be a Schedule 1 drug. What that means in legal terms is the government formally declares it has no medicinal value. So the government is at odds with itself by making it Schedule 1, which is a kind of knee-jerk reaction based on the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, and at the same time, as Peter says, it licensed Sativex, which is the medicinal purpose of cannabis. So cannabis does have a medicinal use, even the government accepts that, although by making it Schedule 1, they make it almost impossible for companies to research it, which is why little research goes on, and why there are hurdles in the way of companies who actually want to take this matter forward. And I predict what will happen is that in the United States, pharmaceutical companies will get more of a green light to investigate these matters. They will then develop products which are useful for medicinal purposes, and we'll end up actually not having produced them in this country, but importing them from the US to the disbenefit of our balance of payments system. That's what's going to happen with that. As far as Les Iverson is concerned, and Peter again referred to Les Iverson, he's the chair of the Advisory Committee on the Misuse of Drugs, the government's formal body on drug advice. And he's made it plain to me when I was a minister, he did not agree with the government's policy on cannabis. He wanted it downgraded from B to C. That's not legalisation, of course, or even decriminalisation. But he recognised that the hysteria which was put around cannabis in terms of the allegations about cannabis was not well founded, and it should be downgraded. That's the official view of the Advisory Committee on Misuse of Drugs.
Can I
Yeah.
Which we had, thank you. The question about how people are taking it anyway. Well, I think what we've seen with the straw poll, which Mr. Hitchens did, and what we've seen with people talking today, is that of course people are going to take it anyway. It's, as the opposition have said, it's effectively decriminalised. I mean, I personally support even de facto legalisation. I would take issue with the issue about black people still being very much criminalised for taking it. However, I think people are, of course, going to take it. So what do we need to do? We need to make sure that people are going to take cannabis in the safest way possible. And there is, of course, a safe way to make sure they take it if we legalise. We can limit quantity, we can limit age, we can limit availability, and, of course, we can raise awareness. We don't have to have advertising. They've presented a scary image of our side as very free market and seeing that there would be cannabis all over the place, this scary sort of dystopian image of everyone using cannabis. That isn't necessarily true. That isn't even what we're arguing for. We're arguing for people being able to use cannabis responsibly as a form of escape, because in our society people need a form of escape. Sadly, that is a problem. I think it's a problem which should be addressed. We shouldn't just take it away from people. It's the same as people saying before, we shouldn't just take away alcohol, because alcohol has a historic root and it has a role in people's lives. Yes, people may abuse it. It's the same with cannabis. People use it as a form of escape. People need that. I personally argue that under capitalism people definitely need something like that. I think that what we can do
even more under communism.
Well, that's possible, but if we allow people freedom, we allow them the choice to be able to take it, and we do that in a responsible way where they get to decide how much and when, and they are able to control it for themselves. I think that's important.
Okay, I have to conclude the If you make it brief.
It'll be very brief. Can I just ask the proposition? Do you agree with the legalisation of heroin? Because a lot of your arguments apply exactly the same to any drug you can think of.
No, I don't, because in each case you analyse what the effects are on the individual, and then you analyse what the effects are on society as a whole. And 48% of acquisitive crime in this country is down to people using heroin or crack cocaine. So clearly there's a negative impact for society, which doesn't apply in the case of cannabis. So I don't know.
Okay, I'm afraid that concludes our questions. I apologise to those that didn't get to ask a question. I'm sorry, no more questions. I'm sorry.
Members of the panel raise their hand if they consume an illegal substance.
Okay. We're going to have to turn to the closing speeches now. So we're going to start with the opposition. We're going to start with Peter Hitchens.
Yeah, well, here we have the enigma of the legalization campaign. Everyone here admits that cannabis is effectively available without any legal risk, that it has been effectively de facto decriminalized in this country, and they can obtain it if they want to. Yet at the same time, it is suggested by the legalization campaign that there is some sort of unfair, draconian criminalization of cannabis users, which there isn't, even though they know there isn't, and that there is a war on drugs, which Norman and people like him constantly tell us has failed, which plainly doesn't exist. The contradictions in this argument are blazingly obvious. So what is it that they're actually arguing for? And I have to stress this again. The only remaining target, and this is a matter of international law, because we are bound by treaty to maintain on our statute books laws banning the sale and production of cannabis in this country. It's international law which they wish to change, in which a huge and extremely well-financed campaign, particularly backed by George Soros, but there are others involved, is anxious to do, is to remove the final international restrictions on the sale and production of cannabis, which would mean that in this country its production and sale would be legal. Now, in whose interest is that? If your interest here is simply that you want to smoke dope and take yourself to perdition in your own way, then I personally would like to see the laws against cannabis possession enforced, because I fear for you and I think it would be a good way of stopping you doing it. But I can't, that's not even under discussion at the moment. If all you want to do is that, then Norman offers you nothing. The only people that the proposition are actually working for in this, whether they know it or not, and I strongly suspect they don't, are big dope. The enormous, well-financed campaign for people to make billions of money all over the world out of selling, marketing, advertising cannabis on a scale never previously seen. And they don't care what happens. Now, I don't think Norman understands what he's arguing for, and I doubt very much whether his companion in the proposition does either. I don't accuse them of being active proponents of this. I think they're dupes.
Thank you very much.
I think they're dupes. Because well, honestly, Norman, the alternative is much, much ruder. I think you'd rather be a dupe than the alternative, which would be so shocking that I think we really ought not, even I, ought not to go that far. But here it is. Here is a campaign. Here's a campaign which benefits only one thing: an enormous commercial lobby for greed at the expense of others' pain. Why would anybody support that? Why would you support it? You're supposed to be, and actually are, quite a principled politician. Why would you support it? Why do you want to support one of the greediest commercial operations ever seen on the face of this planet? Why do you want to? Why do you? Please vote against this very, very dangerous and deceiving motion.